Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan. We're going to be talking about the brain. My goal is to explain the brain from perception to movement to vision to breaking it down all the way to the neuron, all the way up to complex behavior. My goal is to explain all of that in a fun and engaging way, armed with a whiteboard and an even smaller whiteboard. Along the way, we'll be using visuals, we'll be using principles and concepts that very, very smart people have devised before us, and all with the expressed goal to learn about what is going on between our ears here. Now, for just a minute, I want you to marvel for a second, or a minute, or a second, or any time between that. We'll do no longer than 55 seconds. We'll marvel at this thing that's called the brain. The brain is composed of neurons, smaller cells that make up the brain. The way you can think about it is, you have a tree, and this tree is composed of what? Leaves, and these leaves have branches. And so that's how I want you to think about the brain for now. And so imagine a tree that has over 86 billion leaves. That's how many neurons there are in the brain. Now, get this, each of those leaves has 10 to 10,000 different connections. Each neuron has 10 to 10,000 different connections to other neurons. That's over a quintillion amount of connections that a brain could have. Just to put that in perspective, there are more connections in the human brain than there are stars in the observable universe. Wow. And so you might think, how are we going to learn about something that's just so wildly complex? Well, the beautiful thing about the brain, the beautiful thing about neuroscience, is that the brain adheres to rules. There are principles that the brain follow and the brain must adhere to in order to bring about things such as movement and perception and consciousness. It's not just one wild system. There is order to this. And that's why I'm going to be trying to teach about the brain in a fun and engaging and exciting and a relevant way. And so that is something interesting about the brain. There are 86 billion neurons, and each of those neurons having over 10 to 10,000 different connections. That is a wild thing to conceptualize, but it's not impenetrable. We can understand the brain. We can learn from the brain, and we can perhaps, maybe, hopefully, through learning about the brain, we can actually learn about our behavior. That is the end goal, I believe, of neuroscience, is to break the brain down into individual concepts and try to figure out, well, how do these building blocks bring about behavior? And then we'll come to find out that behavior, the study of behavior, psychology, is just the end product of neuroscience. If neuroscience is the math of the brain, then psychology is the application of that math, if you want to think of it like that. And so, I intrinsically love learning about the brain. And so the goal here, again, is to explain the brain in a fun and engaging manner. And so the way I want us to think about the brain, before any videos that we might show in the future, before anything, I want us to think about the brain like a black box that takes in input and then shoots out output. Now that might sound familiar. That might sound actually like a computer. And that's what a computer does. It takes in input, takes in data, takes in information, and it processes that information and gives us an output. And so the first visual that I want us to look at, I'll go ahead and boom. Okay, perfect. And so this visual right here is a pretty straightforward visual. We have input that comes in to a black box. Black box is used in physics as well. It's basically any sort of thing where we're not quite sure what's happening inside. That's why it's black. It's hidden from us. We have no idea what's going on inside this thing. Luckily for us, we know a bit about what's going on in the brain. And so it's not entirely a black box, but it's still sort of shrouded in mystery, and still we're trying to understand the dynamic processes that are happening within it. And so information or input is received to the brain, we'll say, and then output comes out. That's really what it is. Input, information, things such as touch, such as taste, all the senses that we're aware of, also proprioception. There's thousands of bits of information coming into that you're not aware of at all. And they're dealing in things with balance, right? So without that information, we would fall all the time. We would have no sense of proprioception or a sense of where we are in relation to other objects and in relation to space. And so a lot of this input is actually unconscious input, things that we're not aware of. Okay? And so this input is coming in, and it's being processed within the brain here. We'll come to find out this is neuroscience. Neuroscience is a study of what's happening inside this black box. And then beautifully, we have output that comes out. Things such as emotion can be considered an output. Motor actions, riding a bicycle, playing a tune on a piano, other types of behavior as well. You'll find out that neuroscience is a study of what's happening inside the black box here. And psychology would be considered the study of behavior, or what's happening out here. And so we can go here and look. So we can fill stuff in like touch, for example. That's some input that's going in. And then we'll come to find out, well, what is exactly happening inside here where touch is being perceived? What are the processes that are found when we touch an object? And then how can we describe the output, how it comes about through the brain? Okay? So these are some questions that we're going to be answering when studying the brain. And I think this analogy is very, very useful. It has its limitations, which we'll come to find out as we go on and learn more about the brain together. But it's a nice foundation. It's a nice place to start when we want to understand the brain. Okay, so very briefly, we have input. Input is coming in, things such as touch, stimuli in your environment. They're not always conscious. We're not always conscious of this input. And then it comes in and enters the black box, or the brain, in a series of processes, much like a computer happen, takes in that input, and then it applies it on useful, depending on your environment, it'll put out an output. Questions are, okay, what kind of input can the brain receive? We'll come to answer that. What are the processes found within the black box? What are the processes that are happening in the brain to bring about output? How does this happen? How do we go from events happening within the brain to actually skeletal muscular movement, things such as playing the piano and riding the bike? And what are some other outputs that we haven't even considered? Okay? So that's just a brief sort of foundation to conceptually understand the brain. Okay? Okay, and now you notice that suddenly 5 questions of neuroscience has appeared on our board. Oh no, okay, well, what are they? What are the 5 questions of neuroscience? What are some questions that we want to be thinking about whenever we're going and learning about the brain? Okay, and so pretty straightforward, they're simple. First off, well, how does the brain come to be? How does the brain develop? What are the biological and even the genetic sort of aspects that bring about this 3-pound squishy object between our ears? The second one is, how do nerve cells in the brain communicate with one another? So we discussed a little bit briefly that the brain is composed of tiny neurons. These tiny cells are the building blocks of the brain. These cells talk to each other using electrical and chemical signaling. So how do they talk to each other? Okay, and the next question is, how is the different conversations in the brain happening and give rise to things such as perception and motor acts and behavior? Okay, and so that's exactly as I said. How do different patterns of interconnections give rise to different perceptions and motor acts? That's the second question is asking, how do they talk with one another? Third one is, okay, well, how is their talking to each other give rise to the outputs that we alluded to earlier in our input-output analogy, okay? And so the fourth question is, how is the communication between neurons modified by experience? So experience, just our day-to-day living. The brain is being just inundated with stimuli. And so how is this experience, how is the experience that we go through, how do they modify the talks and the conversations between different interconnections in the brain? Okay? And then finally, how is that communication altered by disease? Okay? We'll come to find out that the brain is a very dynamic organ. And in the dynamic nature of the brain is what allows for its complexity and also for its ability to adapt to its environment. Okay? All of these talks, these conversations between different neurons, they form circuits. And these circuits, we can call them correlates in a way. We'll discover new terminology, the vernacular used in neuroscience to discuss these circuits of neurons. How do these circuits bring about different outputs, bring about different behaviors, emotions, perceptions, all of these things? Now, these are the 5 questions of neuroscience that I want us to think about as we go forth and learn more about the brain. Okay? And so, quickly, I wanted to just let y'all know that I'm going to strive for uploading videos at least once a week. And so the next segment will be what I'll title the overall perspective. And in it, we'll be talking about brain and behavior, brain and the neuron, and then brain and the gene. And so I want to talk about how the brain is, what's the relationship between the behavior and the brain. And it will be talking about the history of the brain, how previous neuroscientists looked at the brain, and how those, and oftentimes how they conceptualized it were in contrast to one another. And we'll talk about which view of the brain won out. And then we'll also talk about structure of the brain. We'll talk about briefly about some function of the brain as well in that first video. And then the second video, we'll talk about the neuron. And this is where it gets sort of technical and it can be a bit abstruse, but it rewards a student with perseverance. If you can go through and understand the fundamental building block of the brain, you can really understand holistically what the brain is. Okay? So understanding the neuron is consequential to understanding neuroscience. Then we'll go on to talk about the gene. The gene and how it's relating to the brain, how it relates to neuroscience, how do different genes bring about different behaviors and phenotypes and even different pathologies of the brain. I think I'm going to end there. Thanks for tuning in. I'm very excited about this series. Hopefully I can stick to my promise of uploading a video once a week. And if you really enjoy these videos, be sure to like and recommend them to a friend. And this is John Neuro. Thanks again. Gather around